isn't desire that which moves us towards the good? It actually has a locomotive dimension to it. And even though all the lowercase g goods, even fashion, is ultimately a desire for relationship and God.
Yeah,
and
that's the most fundamental objection to Girard. Yes, of course. Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
You put your finger on it right away.
But I mean, I guess this is a good segue into what I wanted to talk about. When I met you, you were at a program. It wasn't quite a university. It's now a university. The Institute for the Psychological Sciences is now Divine Mercy University. And I'm sure you had a certain idea of what integration is at that point. Has that evolved for you? Do you think differently about how philosophy and psychology and theology intersect now? Did it evolve from being there? Do you think about this very much at all?
I'm much more focused, you might want to say, or impressed by the need for integration, you might want to call through theology. But I think that very little of our life makes sense unless it's interpreted relative to God.
Yes.
And that there was a long time, or maybe it's not so long, maybe it's 30, 40 years, where it's common in the United States for people to think you could kind of hive off reference to God, and that was embarrassing, or a place where people weren't going to agree, or there's not much you could be said about it. And there probably isn't not much you could say about God if you just say, okay, now let's all turn our attention to God and talk about God. Most people won't have a lot of words to say, but it's like C.S. Lewis said, it's not the light, the flashlight, or the fire is not something that you look at. It's that through which you look at everything else. It illuminates everything else.
Yes.
So everything else changes its character if we begin to think of it in relationship to God. And I think we're tremendously harmed if we effectively turn ourselves into an atheistic society by observing speech rules or rules of politeness or what's regarded as proper or not, and exclude consideration of God from our relationships, from our thought, from our discussions, from our deliberations. I think that's intensely damaging to the human person.
Yeah. And I think it's, you could enter through either direction. Going through my training at IPS, I know that integration was a generally new project where we had scholars on one side and clinicians on the other. And the students were sort of going through the gauntlet. The idea is that they come out on the other hand hearing both, and they are the product of integration.
That's what Dan Robinson used to say.
Did he?
Integration. Yeah, they do the integration.
Well, I think that's right. I think just from an intellectual perspective, identifying the constitutive components of the human person in some sort of static way, and that's supposed to inform all of psychology, is limited. I don't think that's helps a clinician learn how to help people and incorporate the spiritual dimension into their healing.
Yes.
But what I mean by coming in through both ways, I can understand someone's spiritual life by looking at their family. Certainly. The things that we say about God as adults, we said about our parents when we were children. Will you protect me? Will you guide me? Will you provide me? Will you nurture me? Right. And as we develop and evolve, we're still children of God asking for those things from him. Right. So I can learn about someone's spiritual life and false projections onto God, by way of how they talk about their family. But you can also learn about their psychological life by coming in through how they talk about their spiritual life. So if I'm working with a client who is sharing their views of who God is, I mean, an extreme hyperbolic example might be, he's sitting on a cloud throwing thunderbolts at me for every venial sin. Well, we're not talking about God anymore. We're talking about your father.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So the connection between relationship patterns I thought was missing in the program.
Yes.
That's what was missing. It was more Thomistic, static, organized, structured. and it wasn't. I don't know. I think when you get into psychodynamic interpersonal theory, it's more complex
Yeah,
than just a listing of, like I said, parts. But when
yeah,
it's just not helpful when it's just a body of knowledge when you're actually trying to help someone. It's to get
yes,
into their emotional experience and see how, hey, what you believe about God is not so. And maybe
yes,
as a clinician, I can participate in God's love for you. I'm not him, but I can participate him and love you the way you were um, meant to be loved, and that can heal your psychological history.
yes. Well, that's a really good point. I mean, I thought that that was a criticism I made of the program when I arrived,
Hmm.
that it was just a matter of structure, studying structure. At least, any kind of psychology that was informed by Thomism was simply a matter of identifying powers,
Yes.
rather than relationships. Yeah, I brought in I thou and other things, trying to remedy that, but I probably didn't succeed. It's very difficult, but
It is
I think
difficult.
I think what you're saying is really very valuable, because it indicates that there's this realm of, you might want to say, analogous relationships, which is really important to study philosophically, but which
Hmm.
has tended to get neglected. A good
Hmm.
example of where it hasn't been neglected, and it's been very, very, so to speak, sexy, is René Girard's understanding of the scapegoating mechanism
Mm.
and mimetic desire. I mean, I think he
Yes.
overplays everything,
Mm.
and sees things that don't exist, and it's not the universal explanation like gravity, which he says it is. But
Can you unpack that a
num
bit for listeners?
right, so René Girard believes that, well, he's a literary theorist. He's not primarily a philosopher, but you could say, well, his system is that there's no such thing as just desiring something for itself. Like, I'm hungry, there's a crispy cold apple on the table, I want the apple, right?
Yeah.
So for him, all desire is in relation to someone else whom
Hmm.
we think of as desiring it. So even just desiring that apple would be a matter of my thinking of, well, if there's somebody beside me, he'd probably want to go for that apple also. So you picture
Hmm.
yourself, or how somebody would look on and be delighted if they saw that I got that apple. So you might want to say all desire is social. You could put it that way, perhaps, right?
Hmm.
So, and that's just an apple when I'm alone on the table. But if you take something like, fashion is pretty clearly, you know, I have a beard because other people have beards, right?
Mm.
It's thought to be a cool way to look, to have a beard, and my wife likes my wearing the beard, probably because she is somehow being, there's like this resonance with other people who are liking beards, right? So
Sure.
desire. So that's the character of desire. So Girard says, well, if desire has that character, then it's inevitably um, involves conflict, because not everyone can get the object of desire then, because if we're all imitating everyone else. So there
Yes.
has to be a resolution to form social unity. There needs
Hmm.
to be this resolution of this unsatisfied conflict of desire, which he thinks takes place through the focus of our contentiousness. We kind of all agree, kind of implicit social contract, to recognize somebody as an outcast and a scapegoat who's outside of this whole process of mimetic desire, and we
Yeah.
just we just exclude and put this person to death, perhaps as the scapegoat that
Like
purges
Christ.
us. Yep, he gives an interpretation of the crucifixion on these grounds of the
Yes.
meaning, why the Christ affects us so much, because and so that constitutes now us as a society, because we can all turn towards the scapegoat and unify through the scapegoat. So
Yes.
that's his theory, but you can see how it does involve relationships. It is philosophical. Um, it's dynamic. It, I mean, by dynamic, I mean it says it gives a process or sequence that unfolds over time, right?
Yeah.
Um, and it's far, obviously, desire is now being reinterpreted. Desire is nothing like just a component, a faculty within a single person. So there's a social public aspect of desire. So that would be an example of a theory that I think Girard, came up with this idea. He thinks it's like Newton's law of universal gravity that explains everything in the social domain. That's why he's a bit of an eccentric cult type character rather than,
Sure.
I would say, fully balanced thinker. But my point is that that's an example of the kind of thing that should be pursued more.
Yeah. Isn't it the case? I mean, if you start to bring Thomas Aquinas in a bit, isn't desire that which moves us towards the good? It actually has a locomotive dimension to it. And even though all the lowercase g goods, even fashion, is ultimately a desire for relationship and God.
Yeah,
And
that's the most fundamental objection to Girard. Yes, of course. Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
You put your finger on it right away.
Yeah. I think what psychology offers to this conversation is that, and this is where we can lean into theology a bit, is that anxiety, which anxiety did not exist before the fall. Anxiety occurs in the space between myself and another, ultimately between myself and God. And communion with God, there's no more anxiety, and desire is fulfilled. There's that perfect communion with God and the beatific vision, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. But all death is, all depression and anxiety ultimately, because those are kind of flip sides of the same coin. You don't really have people who suffer from anxiety without depression. Some are prone to one or the other, but I mean, they're coupled. All of it is fear of death, because death represents the ultimate separation from the other. You can't go with me. I think of Samwise Gamgee. Don't go where I can't follow you, Mr. Frodo. From Lord of the Rings. So anxiety is that separation from other people. In our lives, going all the way back, we start to form these crystallized personality patterns, these defenses, which are designed to keep us in connection with those parental figures. And there's nothing wrong with that per se. But when they become so crystallized and compulsive, and then we can do nothing else but that one thing, and there's no freedom, that because over and over and over again in these relationships, it carries into adulthood. So if I only got attention in my home because I was funny, that's the only time mom and dad gave me attention. That's I learned how to get some kind of care, interest. Well, now I always have to be funny. Now I'm anxious if I'm not funny. Now I suck up all the interest in the room, being funny at the expense of other people. There's nothing wrong with being charismatic and being funny, but there's no flexibility to it. Right. And that's when you start to get into histrionic personality defenses. A lot of actors, a lot of comedians, they can't not be funny. When someone's suffering, they're still looking for the joke when someone's, in front of them being funny. So, and we have these, it's all based on relationship patterns. The patterns embed the psychopathology. And when oftentimes mood disorders are a byproduct of an incongruence between the interior architecture of the personality and the environment. So somebody who's narcissistic might do fine for a long time until they get fired. Now they're anxious and depressed. But the problem isn't just targeting the anxiety and depression with some short-term band-aids or strategies to help you be less depressed. No, it's reshaping the tectonic plates of the personality, which may have been hidden for a very, very long time.
Yes.
And it's all embedded in these personality patterns. So this is what I think good psychology can contribute, to see how these patterns are crystallized. And then as a clinician, you can see how it's actually playing out with you. Because the person isn't just doing it with everyone else. They're doing it with you. And then to provide a corrective experience, which says, I love you even if you're not funny. You are not your gifts. In fact, you can show me these parts of yourself which are sad, which are angry, which are boring, which aren't interesting. And that has no bearing on whether or not I love you.
Yeah.
And that sounds like, subjectively, that seems like an impossibility. As we're going through life, we think if we're smart enough, funny enough, rich enough, whatever, these accidentals, whatever, if we're enough of those things, then we are loved. But that's refuted very easily by just thinking about when you're a parent, right? There's nothing your child could do that make you not love them. You want things to go well for them, so you teach them, but screwing up hurts because you love them. So I don't think people this is the most common, if I had to boil down all of my clinical work, it's the idea, it's the problem of people thinking that they need to earn love. that it's something earned and it's a gift. And I also don't even think we know why we're loved.
Yeah.
Don't the theologians and philosophers like wrestle with that question? Why does God love us? I don't know, but he does. Why do we love our children? I don't know. Not fully. We can try and describe characteristics, but there's a mysterious quality, right?
Yeah. That's interesting you say that, because I think it's a fundamentally Catholic idea that we shouldn't try to earn God's love. But the reformers thought that was specifically Catholic mistake, and they insisted that that's what they meant by salvation, by faith alone, that we don't try to earn salvation through doing works. The Catholic Church never believed that we earn salvation by doing works. I mean, Jesus wasn't the result of our getting together and working really hard. He wasn't incarnate because we worked really hard. He didn't suffer on the cross because we all got together and did all kinds of works. It wasn't a corporate corporation that was formed. But it's kind of interesting. So you've just done something very Girardian. You've just linked together the primary source of worry and depression to a fundamentally an attitude which is related to a lack of faith. So it helps to explain why confidence in God's fatherly care is so good for our psyches too at the same time.
Yes. Yeah. And the good news, I think, the conclusion of all this, the good news, the gospel, is that death, which represents the ultimate separation. I mean, it's a revolving door for Jesus. He doesn't care.
Yeah.
He holds our hands through the doors of death. Like he's conquered that too. And that's the great Christian hope, I think.
But there's an answer why God loves us. God loves us because we're good. We're created good. And we're made in his image. And we are as if sons and daughters, even by nature, because we're made in his image. So he doesn't want us to be lost. The devils, when they turned against him at the first moment of the creation, their choice is fixed. There's no prospect for salvation. They had to choose either to place themselves under God's care or to rebel against him. And there's no moment in time that takes place in an instant. That process takes place in an instant. But for us, the choice of God or against God takes place over a lifetime. And so there's something wrecked in us that God wants to save. That's why he sent his son. It's still in play. So long as we're alive, it's in play. It's something that he loves dearly that's been wrecked and he wants to restore.
Yeah. Doesn't he, well, our goodness, though, isn't it dependent upon his goodness? So,
yes. And furthermore, we're good in being created good. So it's because he saw us as good and then created us according to that conception that we're good. So the love of God is creative.
Yes.
So there's a creative love of God, and you might say reactive love of God, where he looks at his creation and then takes delight in it. He rests at the end of every day and he says it's good. That's also love.
Yeah, I think we're starting into the mystery of the I thou here for me, where I get lost in the multiple subjects, which is that he creates outside of himself, out of nothing, which is not him, and he sees the goodness which only exists because it's him.
Yes,
we participate in that goodness, but he loves that because of his goodness. But he's not loving himself; he is loving us, which is different than him. So I don't know. There's still a question mark in there for me somewhere in terms of why he loves us, because he's he's not loving himself.
He does. He is loving himself. I mean, God is the greatest good. So if our greatest good consists in loving God above all, and certainly his does. I mean, he loves himself above all, but he should. That's the nature of love. Love should be attracted to the best object.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's why he says, love your neighbor as yourself.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, right.
Yeah.